In part one of our study, we answered yes to the simple question if the rapture is biblically sound. In part two, we asked the question if the rapture is also seen in 1 Corinthians 15. There again, the answer was yes. There was clear connections between 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. The being changed in a twinkling of an eye of 1 Corinthians 15:52 is speaking of the same moment as the being caught up in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. At this point in the study, it becomes very difficult to avoid discussing the timing of the rapture. Just go down to the comments section, and everybody's already going back and forth as to what their view is and why. When it comes to timing views, is that you have heard of these six if you've studied the rapture in depth before. I put them in this order because it reflects a chronological order, if you will, in relation to the tribulation period. But before one can start advocating for a certain position, or maybe should, is that the person should be defining what does the phrase tribulation period even mean. And if you're a total novice in eschatology, is that discussing what the tribulation period is needed for you in this study. The idea of a tribulation period comes from two Old Testament texts primarily. Jeremiah 30, verse 7, that says, "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." And the other is Daniel 12:1 that says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." I did the highlighting for you already, so the phrases discussing the tribulation period popped out to you. And as you can see, is that these two verses are identical with one another. Israel experiences intense persecution, but will be delivered from it by God. The Hebrew word for trouble is the same in both verses. It does get translated into affliction a lot in the Old Testament, but 3 times it does get translated as tribulation. When the Greek translators got a hold of these verses, is that they went 2 different routes. Daniel 12:1 thalipsis is the main one that we are concerned with, as this is the one used by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. In Mark's account, affliction was used in the KJV, but they are clearly quoting Jesus in the same manner. The phrase Great Tribulation only occurs 4 times in the New Testament. The one in Acts 7:11 doesn't deal with the end times, whereas Revelation 2:22 to the church of Thyatira does, and Revelation 7:14's great multitude that came out of the Great Tribulation does as well. You should make a mental note here, as this is an interlude chapter between the 6th and 7th seal. In part 1, we showed that the 6th bowl discusses the day of the Lord and the Battle of Armageddon, whose description is tied to the rapture in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Daniel 12:1 is also tied to that as well, as it was talking about persecution under the king of the north, also known as the little horn of Daniel 7, where in both visions the time times half a times phrase is used in conjunction with 1,290 days, which is 3.5 years. Revelation 12:4 uses that phrase as well, denoting the 3.5 year period. We all know who comes to the rescue at the end of this period. Back in Daniel is that 927 discusses the final 70th week of that prophecy, where this 1 week period of 7 years has a figure in the middle of the week causing the abomination of desolation. This is exactly what you see when you line up Daniel 7 and 12 with 927. The textual connections are obvious that they are speaking of the same 3.5 year period, which is a period of intense persecution on the people of God. John picks up on Daniel's 3.5 year period and mentions it 5 times in Revelation. Now, some might take chapter 11's 2 witnesses, 3.5 years description as the first part of the 70th week. And that all really depends on who a person believes the 2 witnesses are or represent. Regardless of that, is that 12:14's time, times, and half a time, it definitely cannot be disconnected from Daniel. Therefore, Revelation 13's beast is clearly the Antichrist figure from the identical descriptions of both sides that tie these two together. All that said is that when you go back to Jesus' description of the Great Tribulation in his remark of Matthew 24:1, and you keep in mind that just before this, he directly referenced Daniel's abomination of desolation, is that charted out, the Great Tribulation period covers the last half of the 70th week with Christ's return and defeat of the Antichrist at the end. So, when I said I listed these in chronological order manner, is that this chart explains what I meant as it depicts the timing in relation to the 7 year period, also known as Daniel's 70th week. Now, this chart seems pretty biblically clear cut, but there are those that don't hold to a 7 year tribulation period, but simply consider the whole church age as the 70th week, or even the last half of the 70th week as the whole church age. This is taking the 70th week in a non-literal view, more symbolic in nature. Probably the most well-known scholar with this view is G.K. Beale. His commentaries on Revelation are probably the thickest material that you'll come across. I do like his stuff, as he is exhaustively laying out all of what in the Old Testament and other Second Temple Jewish literature that John was drawing upon to explain all of his apocalyptic visions in Revelation. And he and others who reject a literal 7 year, 70th week typically do this by first stating that the New Testament says that we are in the last days. So, from the cross to now is that it does have to be defined this way. Then, when it comes to thlipsis, the Greek word for tribulation, is that Jesus tells the disciples that you will have tribulation, meaning that tribulation, is a present thing in the world and not a far off future period only for a select group. Acts 14:22 says believers must go through tribulation, much tribulation, to enter into the kingdom of God. Paul told the church at Rome to be patient in tribulation. To both the Corinthians and Ephesians, he talks about his and theirs tribulation. And even to the Thessalonians, in the second letter, he says that they are going through tribulation right now. The Apostle John opens up Revelation saying he's a companion in tribulation with the 7 churches. And Jesus said that he knows the church at Smyrna's tribulation. So, with all those verses that clearly say that believers experience tribulation and that it's not just reserved for a select group in a last 7 year period, is that Beale and others will argue that the whole church age should be seen as a or the tribulation period until Christ's return. In this regard, they are then inherently post trib advocates. Within this camp, you will find some that still see a future Antichrist figure that will emerge one day. But you will also find those that see Antichrist figures throughout all of history persecuting the church, especially since John in his letters says there are already antichrists in the world and that we are in the last times. 4 verses later, he says that anyone who denies Jesus is an antichrist. 2 chapters later, he says that the spirit of antichrist is in the world already. And he repeats this in his second letter, that denying Jesus is to be an antichrist. So, you put all this together, is that you can see how they can view the 70th week or the last 3.5 years representing the whole church age. I, however, do not. I'm not denying tribulation has not or won't continue to exist for believers until Christ's coming. What I am saying is that Jesus' description of the Great Tribulation and John's in Revelation are referring to a specific 3.5 year period at the very end of days that is clearly rooted in Daniel 12:1, that within that vision, Daniel asked, how long will it last? And was told 1,290 days. And John doubled down on this in Revelation, using both days and months to describe the time, times, and half a time period. You should not be taking those numbers symbolically, nor should you take the day year prophetic idea and apply it to this and turn it into 1,060 years or 1,290 years. And since Daniel's 70th week is textually tied with that final 3.5 year period, is that you can't throw this interpretation out. But at the same time, nor should we throw out all this data. But what we should be doing is having both of these understandings merged into our heads, regardless of what your rapture timing view is. You can think of it in similar respects to the idea of the kingdom of God being described as already present, but at the same time not fully realized yet either. These are not contradictions in the New Testament, but what scholars call an already but not yet situation. This is no different when you read about how you have been sanctified, past tense, yet you are still being sanctified throughout your walk. Both of those realities are true at the same time, and this appears to be in similar lines with how tribulation is described in the Bible. So, even if you take a pre-trib view, doesn't mean you personally, or even your collective, local, or regional church body can't experience tribulation. Church history is a giant persecution period, especially for those in the Middle East and Eastern countries in recent centuries. You can't say that the Great Persecution period under Emperor Diocletian wasn't tribulation. Christians were stripped of all legal rights, forced to sacrifice to pagan gods, renounce Christ. But if a believer refused to renounce, they were arrested, tortured, and potentially put to death, with a lot of them being used as entertainment in the Colosseum. Fast forward to the 20th century, Soviet Russia began widespread persecution of outspoken Christians. Wikipedia's page on this gives a great overview of how Lenin, right from the onset, aimed to dismantle religion throughout the nation. The state never officially outlawed religion, but its policies from the very beginning prohibited any religion in any facet being taught in public or even private schools. This showed clearly what the Communist Party's intent was. Some church leaders resisted, but the Communist Party didn't back down from them and began to imprison outspoken believers by putting them into forced labor camps and even beginning to torture them in the hopes of getting them to renounce their faith. The most notable example of this is Richard Wurmbrand's 14 years in prison, where he and others that shared the gospel were brutally tortured. Please get that book, go ahead and read it, and then try to come back and say that tribulation hasn't existed yet in the world. You just can't read 2 pages without absolutely coming to the conclusion that, man, that was just horrific what those people dealt with. And on the flip side is that even if you take the symbolic view, is that you cannot deny a future big A Antichrist, because even though John said many Antichrists are already in the world, is that he still depicts the little horn as a future singular tyrant that is empowered by Satan, which is what his audience in his first letter were anticipating as well. The shall come language is the same thing described in Daniel 9:26 of the prince that shall come, who textually should be identified with the little horn / king of the north from chapters 7 and 11, who will initiate a covenant where 3.5 years later will cause the abomination of desolation, and from that point will go on a persecuting spree that the world has never seen before, and will only end when Christ returns.
Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripted.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.